Today in the Daily Dose, the liberation of Paris. Upon word of the approach of General George Patton's Third Army towards the outskirts of Paris, the French forces of the interior, part of the French resistance, staged an uprising against the German garrison occupying the city. 7 weeks after Operation Overlord and the D-Day invasion of Normandy, on the night of August 24, 1944, elements of General Philippe Leclerc's 2nd French Armored Division made their way into Paris shortly before midnight. The next morning, they would be joined by the bulk of the U.S. 4th Infantry Division, whereupon Wehrmacht Commander Dietrich von Choltitz surrendered to the French at the Hotel Maurice, the newly established headquarters of General Charles de Gaulle of the victorious French army. Despite scattered attempts at scorched earth and sabotage by the retreating Wehrmacht forces, when elements of the French, British, and American armies poured into the city, Parisians responded with cheers, wine, and kisses. Allied airmen flying low over the city saw little material damage, but after 4 years of German uniforms, jackboots, swastikas, and Nazi salutes, Parisians were swept away by a tidal wave of jubilation and relief. Approaching Notre Dame Cathedral by way of the Hotel de Ville, snipers opened fire at General de Gaulle's motorcade. People in the crowds crouched down or ran for cover, while de Gaulle himself largely ignored the threat. When the snipers were put out of action, the city would see 4 straight days of celebration and parades. Vive Paris! Vive de Gaulle! Vive la France! Operation Reunion. When the Soviets swept into Romania in late August 1944, the subsequent release of 1,162 captured Allied airmen sent a wave of optimism throughout the 15th Air Force in Italy, as well as a major morale boost for the American public back home. Operation Reunion stands to this day as one of the high-water feel-good moments of World War II. As the highest-ranking prisoner of war in Romania, Lieutenant Colonel James A. Gunn promptly received permission to organize the repatriation of Allied POWs to their British and Italian air bases. Gunn teamed up with Constantine Cantacuzino, a 38-year-old Romanian prince who commanded the 9th Fighter Group for the Romanian Air Force. Bazou, as he was known to his friends, cut a dashing figure with his movie star good looks and vibrant personality. Before the war, Bazou had captained the Romanian hockey team, broken an automobile speed record between Bucharest and Paris, and later won a national aerobatics championship that elevated him to superstar status in Romania. Adored by women, according to one of his friends, Bazou had his pick from countesses to cooks. With Gunn wedged into the cramped radio compartment of Bazou's German-built Messerschmitt 109, with American flags hastily painted on both sides of the fuselage, Bazou flew the pair into Gunn's home airbase at San Giovanni, Italy, delighting an audience of 15th Air Force personnel when the much-loved commanding officer emerged from the tiny single-seat fighter. 56 B-17s were mustered for the airlift of POWs, flying into Romania in 3 waves of 12 bombers each, timed to arrive in Bucharest at 1-hour intervals. A total of 739 POWs were repatriated on August 31st, while the remaining 393 prisoners would fly home on September 1st, including 12 ambulatory patients on stretchers. The final stragglers who had evaded capture in Romania would be flown home on September 3rd, closing out Operation Reunion with a total of 59 Fortress sorties, 94 Lightning sorties, 281 Mustang sorties, and 1 C-47 sortie, repatriating a total of 1,127 Americans, 31 British airmen, 2 Dutch naval officers, 1 French soldier, and a Romanian stowaway with shaky claims to American citizenship. Back at their respective bases, half-starved POWs slowly came back to life. Operation Market Garden. With the intent of hastening the end of war with Germany, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery devised a plan to create a 64-mile salient or bulge along the northern end of the Germans' thus far impregnable Siegfried Line in the Netherlands, establishing a massive offensive opening for an Allied push into the industrial heartland of Germany's Ruhr Valley. Codenamed Market Garden, the market part of the operation called for 3 airborne divisions to land men and equipment by parachutes and gliders, while ground forces, the garden half of the plan, would cross 6 formidable water obstacles, seizing vital territory and bridges on their push to the Rhine River. Plagued by mistakes from the operation's first engagement on September 17, 1944, some 10,000 British and Polish troops from the British 1st Airborne were dropped miles from their objective at Arnhem due to heavy German anti-aircraft defenses around the city. Fewer than 800 men would reach the Arnhem Bridge, while the rest were forced into a pocket by 2 German panzer divisions near the village of Oysterbeek. To add to the operation's problems, bad weather and a shortage of transport planes slowed the buildup of Allied troops on the ground, landing men over a 3-day buildup period instead of all at once, which negated any chance for an overwhelming assault against dug-in German forces. To make matters worse, radio communication was made useless by flat-wooded landscapes and spread-out landing zones, further dampening Allied attempts at a coordinated offensive. Allied ground relief columns led by Britain's XXX Corps discovered that roads leading up to Arnhem were too narrow for adequate tank passage, made worse by German infantrymen who picked off 9 leading British tanks with anti-tank weapons, further limiting Allied progress to a mere 8 miles during their first day on the ground. The slow Allied advance gave Germany time to strengthen its defenses, which effectively stalled Allied ground troops near the town of Nijmegen, while the British X-Corps suffered crippling losses at Arnhem. With the main objective of Operation Market Garden lost by September 24th, of the approximate 10,600 Allied troops who pushed their way north across the Rhine, only 2,700 would retreat in failure on September 25th, after suffering 7,900 casualties in their failed offensive over the 9-day battle that made up Operation Market Garden. While seizing much of the Netherlands from German control, the Allies would see more than 17,000 casualties, while the Germans suffered 8,000. If Operation Market Garden had gone as planned, military historians believe that World War II in Europe could well have ended before Christmas of 1944, but instead, the conflict in Europe would drag on for another 5 long months, until Soviet troops overtook Berlin in May of 1945, making Operation Market Garden one of the worst Allied blunders of the Second World War. The Battle of the Bulge. Called the greatest American battle of the war by Winston Churchill, the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes region of Belgium was Hitler's last major offensive in World War II against the Western Front. Lasting 6 brutal weeks in raw winter conditions from December 16, 1944 to January 25, 1945, some 30 German divisions attacked battle-weary American troops across 85 miles of densely wooded forest. When the Nazis' unexpected offensive swept into the Ardennes, the Allied line buckled and pulled back in the appearance of a large herniated bulge, which gave the battle its everlasting name. The formerly serene region of Ardennes was hacked to pieces by brutal fighting against the German advance at St. Vith, Elsenborn Ridge, Helfalize, and Bastogne, leading U.S. Army soldier Charlie Sanderson to write of the event. "Did you ever see land when a tornado's come through? Did you ever see trees and stuff twisted and broken off? The whole friggin' forest was like that." Belgian townspeople put away their Allied flags and brought out their swastikas, not knowing which side would ultimately win the battle. Hitler's mid-December blitzkrieg banked heavily on the strategic nature of bad weather, subjecting American troops to freezing rain, thick fog, deep snowdrift, and record-breaking low temperatures, resulting in more than 15,000 cold injuries, such as trench foot, pneumonia, and frostbite. I was from Buffalo. I thought I knew cold reflects Baseball Hall of Famer and World War II veteran Warren Spahn, but I didn't really know cold until the Battle of the Bulge. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower and George S. Patton Jr. led the American offensive to restore the weakened front, sending in 230,000 soldiers and airborne units into Bastogne, where the Germans had surrounded thousands of Allied troops. When the Germans sent a message demanding the surrender of the 101st Airborne Division on December 22, 1944, they got a one-word answer from its commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, and that word was nuts. 3 days later, Patton's Third Army finally arrived to push back the German line and rescue the surrounded troops. Germany's failure to divide American forces embedded in the Ardennes paved the way to victory for the Allies, but only at an egregiously high price. 1 million plus Allied troops fought in the Battle of the Bulge, with approximately 19,000 soldiers killed in action, 47,500 wounded, and 23,000 plus missing and forever unaccounted for. The Germans suffered almost matching losses, making the Battle of the Bulge one of the bloodiest events of the war. The Yalta Conference and the fate of post-war Europe. Known as the Crimea Conference, or more popularly the Yalta Conference, the big three Allied leaders came together at a palace in the Black Sea resort town of Yalta to determine the post-war fate of Europe. Arriving on the 4th of February, 1945, and lasting for the next 7 days, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin met at Levadia Palace to shape a post-war peace that represented not just a collective security order, but a plan to give self-determination to the liberated peoples of post-Nazi occupied Europe. Marking the third wartime meeting between the big three, by the time of the Yalta Conference, the Allies had liberated all of France and Belgium, with fighting now closing in on the western border of Germany, while in the east, Soviet forces were less than 40 miles from Berlin, having already pushed the Germans out of Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. During the talks, Stalin agreed to enter the Pacific War against Japan within 3 months after the fall of Germany, and since the Russians had suffered egregious losses to German aggression in both world wars, the group agreed that Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria, the historical corridors for forces attempting to invade Russia, would remain in the Soviet sphere as a security buffer for a war-weary Soviet nation. The conference further set the boundaries for post-war occupation zones in Germany, including one for each 3 principal Allied nations attending the conference, along with a 4th zone for France, whose leader Charles de Gaulle was snubbed from the meeting, a diplomatic slight that caused a deep and lasting resentment in the French leader. Despite the fact that Berlin resided in the Soviet zone, the city was further divided into 4 zones of occupation, again by the principal Allied nations. A declaration of liberated Europe was also created by the Big Three, which encouraged the people of Europe to create democratic institutions of their own design and to hold free elections for governments responsive to the will of the people. Bombing Dresden. Known as the German Florence on the Elbe, before the Allies' bombing of Dresden, on February 13th, 14th, and 15th of 1945, the city was a center of European culture and Baroque splendor, home to famous collections of art, porcelain, and scientific institutions. Coming less than a month after 19,000 U.S. troops were killed at Germany's last-ditch offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, and 3 weeks after the discovery of Nazi atrocities committed at Auschwitz, Allied war planners chose the city due to its rail and roadway networks, with the additional intent of terrorizing civilian populations throughout Germany in an effort to force the Germans to at long last sue for peace. Destroying Greater Dresden in a campaign that witnessed 800 bombers drop some 2,700 tons of explosives and incendiaries over the city. The bombings caused wind-driven firestorms that sucked out oxygen as it incinerated buildings and humans alike, at the same time losing only 6 bombers after the destruction of the German Luftwaffe and the city's now ruined anti-aircraft defenses. American prisoners of war were moved 2 stories underground in a meatpacking house as the bombings began, including future author Kurt Vonnegut, whose book Slaughterhouse-Five records his experiences during and after the bombing. Those who have unlearned how to cry, wrote German writer Gerhard Hauptmann, will learn it afresh on the destruction of Dresden. While initial death toll estimates rose as high as 200,000 dead, as Nazi apologist David Irving claimed in his 1963 book, The Destruction of Dresden, a figure long accepted by early war historians. Critics eventually pounced on Irving's lack of evidence and his complete refusal to acknowledge the estimated 6 million people killed in the Holocaust. Years later, Irving gained notoriety as a Holocaust denier, which resulted in his criminal conviction in 2006. In an attempt to silence right-wing ideologues from exploiting the death toll, in 2004, the city of Dresden established a historical commission to produce more precise data using historical, military, forensic, and archaeological research, publishing revised estimates in 2010 of 22,700 to 25,000 dead, making the bombing of Dresden one of the last brutal acts of the Second World War. The Battle of Iwo Jima. A mere 750 miles from mainland Japan, Iwo Jima's 2 Japanese airfields made the island a perfect staging point for the Allies' potential invasion of the Empire of Japan. American military leaders felt that they could take the tiny South Pacific island in a matter of days, but in truth, the Japanese had secretly fortified the island with 21,000 troops and high-ground camouflaged artillery positions, along with fortified jungle bunkers and 11 miles of tunnels bored into the mountainous volcanic island. Beginning with punishing aerial bombardment and naval artillery fire that went on for 72 days, the United States Navy and Air Force did everything in their power to soften Japanese positions before ground troops were sent in to secure the island. Beginning on February 19, 1945, the U.S. Marines conducted massive amphibious landings on Iwo Jima, where they encountered steep dunes of soft volcanic ash, making footholds and vehicle passage treacherous at best. Playing along with the Allies' belief that the Allies' pre-landing bombardment had crushed Japanese defensive positions, commanding Japanese General Tadamichi Kuribayashi held fire until a significant number of Marines had established a beachhead, finally opening up against the Americans from high-ground artillery fortifications. But despite heavy American casualties, the Marines soon captured both airfields, which was the core mission set forth by Marine Commander Holland "Howlin' Mad" Smith. Within days, some 70,000 Marines had landed on Iwo Jima, outnumbering Japanese forces by 3 to 1. The next 5 weeks of fighting would become some of the bloodiest in World War II, with an estimated 25,000 Allied casualties and nearly 7,000 deaths. 4 days into the fighting, the Marines captured Mount Suribachi on the island's south side, famously raising an American flag at the summit, which was captured by AP photographer Joe Rosenthal, who later won a Pulitzer Prize for his iconic image. While Japanese forces were all but wiped out over the 5-week engagement, only 216 would be taken prisoner, some of whom were captured only after they were knocked unconscious or disabled at the time of their imprisonment. After the Allies' victory at Iwo Jima, neither the U.S. Navy or the U.S. Army ever used the island as a staging area, while the Air Force only used the rebuilt airfields for emergency landings, causing many post-war scholars to wonder if the Americans' sacrifices on Iwo Jima was worth the human toll. Operation Plunder. After the Allies' successful D-Day landings at Normandy, Allied commanders now set their sights on the Rhine River and the invasion of the German motherland, with the ultimate goal of bringing down the Nazi High Command at their capital city, Berlin. Beginning in late February, General Patton's Third Army battled their way through the lower Moselle Valley, north of Trier, collapsing German resistance as they pushed onward toward the Rhine. On March the 5th, First Army troops reached the northern and southern outskirts of Cologne, Germany's fourth largest city, while men of the 3rd Armored Division methodically eliminated pockets of resistance in 15 suburban towns ringing the city. On March 22, 1945, the 5th Infantry Division was first across the Rhine at Oppenheim, Germany, just south of Mainz, catching German troops completely by surprise due to the Allies' lack of advanced artillery bombardment, making the event the first breach of the Rhine since Napoleon's crossing in 1805. A day later, led by British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and his 21st Army Group, Allied troops initiated Operation Plunder at the German cities of Rees and Wiesel, supported by Lieutenant General Miles Dempsey's British Second Army and Lieutenant General William H. Simpson's U.S. 9th. 4,000 Allied guns lay down a 4-hour punishing assault on German positions east of the Rhine, while after nightfall, the 17th Armored Engineer Battalion built floating treadways across the Rhine roughly 3 miles south of Wiesel. After the artillery barrage ended, thousands of aircraft of the 1st Allied Airborne Army inserted some 16,000 paratroopers east of the Rhine on March 24th, proving to be the largest single-day, single-location airborne operation ever conducted. Fortified by hard lessons learned during Operation Market Garden, by the end of the day, airborne troops and Allied divisions had linked up with the 15th Scottish Army, and while the last fierce German resistance was broken on March 25th after an 18-day offensive at the Battle of Remagen, by March 27th, an Allied bridgehead had been achieved east of the Rhine, some 35 miles wide and 20 miles deep, making Operation Plunder one of the last major roadblocks during the Allies' determined push for Berlin. A standout hero at Hacksaw Ridge. Born in 1919 Lynchburg, Virginia, Desmond T. Doss was a conscientious cooperator, as he later described himself, and while he could have applied for a deferment from military service based on his religious refusal to bear arms, he joined the Army despite death threats and near constant harassment during boot camp. both from his enlisted compatriots up to his commanding officers. Refusing to buckle under pressure, Doss shipped out for the Pacific in 1944 as a medic with the 307th Infantry Regiment, fighting with his unit first in Guam, where he was awarded a Bronze Star for valor after he treated wounded men despite extreme jeopardy to his life. He earned a second Bronze Star for his unwavering performance during firefights on Leyte, where his courage under fire saved countless lives despite heavy and intense mortar fire, grenade strikes, and machine gun fire. By the time Doss and his unit moved to Okinawa, any reservations by his fellow soldiers about the medic's courage under fire had turned to deep respect, which only intensified on May 2, 1945, when American soldiers attacked Japanese fortifications atop the 400-foot-tall Hacksaw Ridge during the Battle of Okinawa. At the top of the cliff face stood a 35-foot granite overhang, forcing men of the 307th to climb cargo netting to reach entrenched Japanese forces above. Men dropped like flies under a hail of Japanese machine gun fire, and over the next several days of dogged fighting, Doss put himself in continuous mortal danger in his attempts to aid his fallen comrades. On May the 5th, the Japanese intensified their efforts to repel American forces, and when Doss's commanding officer ordered a retreat, he refused to leave an estimated 75 wounded men behind. Too injured to retreat on their own, Doss rescued all 75 men trapped at the top of Hacksaw Ridge, lowering them down with a rope until all men were brought to safety and much-needed medical care. Later that same month, Doss was wounded several times by grenade fragments and a sniper's bullet through an arm. Yet despite the severity of his injuries, he refused medical attention until those more seriously wounded could be tended to. Due to the extent of his injuries, Doss was evacuated in late May, returning home to Virginia, where he spent years recovering from his wounds, as well as tuberculosis, which he had contracted on Leyte. On October 12, 1945, President Harry S. Truman presented Doss with the Medal of Honor in a White House ceremony, where Truman said after awarding the medal that "I consider this a greater honor than being president." The only conscientious objector to receive America's highest combat medal, Doss later said that he won the medal because "I kept the golden rule that we read in Matthew 7:12, that all things whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them," making Desmond T. Doss a standout hero amongst a generation of standout American fighting men. The Battle of Okinawa. With war in Europe in its final mop-up stages, mere weeks away from Germany's unconditional surrender, American forces in the Pacific Theater of Operations closed in on Okinawa's 466 square miles of mountainous jungles, with the knowledge that if Okinawa fell, so would the warring nation of Japan. At dawn on the morning of April 1st, 1945, American troops aboard Fifth Fleet warships expected an amphibious landing massacre far worse than the D-Day invasions at Normandy, only to find Okinawa's beachheads poorly defended by the Japanese. Within hours, American forces had secured both the Kadena and Yantan airfields, which were vital to the Allies' planned invasion of the Japanese mainland. As wave after wave of American forces pushed inland, they walked unwittingly into Commanding General Yoshijima's Shuri defense line, where his 130,000-man army launched crippling attacks from heavily fortified high-ground positions, leading to a string of bloody battles, which raged until late June, including Kakazu Ridge, Sugarloaf Hill, Horseshoe Ridge, Half Moon Hill, and the now infamous Hacksaw Ridge. Behind them on the South Pacific, with their backs against a collapsing war effort, on April 7th, Japan's mighty battleship the Yamato attempted a surprise attack on the Fifth Fleet, with plans to wipe out American troops pinned down near the Shuri line, only to be discovered by Allied submarines, which led to its sinking during crippling air attacks, despite Japan's increasingly desperate reliance on kamikaze suicide pilots that caused massive losses to American lives and warships. Facing imminent defeat, many Japanese troops and Okinawan civilians committed ritual suicide under the false belief that Americans took no prisoners. Faced with the reality that additional fighting was futile, on June 22nd, General Yoshijima and his Chief of Staff General Cho also took their own lives, effectively ending the Battle of Okinawa. Both sides suffered egregious losses, including 49,000 casualties for the Americans, with some 12,520 killed in action, while the Japanese witnessed the death of an estimated 110,000 soldiers and 40,000 to 150,000 Okinawa civilians. The Allies would also lose 36 warships, with another 368 damaged and 763 aircraft shot down or destroyed, making the Battle of Okinawa the last major engagement during World War II, before nuclear detonations over Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the Second World War. The last days of Adolf Hitler. By early 1945, Nazi Germany was on the verge of total military collapse. Poland had fallen to the advancing Soviet Red Army, which was preparing to cross the Oder River between Kustrin and Frankfurt an der Oder, with the objective of capturing Berlin, 51 miles to the west. German forces had recently lost to the Allies in the Ardennes offensive in France, while British and Canadian forces were crossing the Rhine into the German industrial heartland of the Ruhr. U.S. forces in the south had captured Lorraine and were advancing toward Mainz, Mannheim, and the Rhine. German forces in Italy were withdrawing northward as they were pressed by the Allies as part of the spring offensive to advance across the Po and into the foothills of the Alps. In a nutshell, Germany's war effort was in a state of endgame. During an afternoon situation conference on April 22nd, Hitler suffered a total nervous breakdown when he was informed that the orders he had issued the previous day for an all-out counteroffensive had not been obeyed, leading Hitler to confess for the first time that Germany's war of aggression had finally been lost. Hitler then announced that he would stay in Berlin until the bitter end, taking his own life before the Allies could capture him alive. Luftwaffe chief Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring learned about Hitler's suicide pact and sent a telegram to Hitler asking for permission to take over the leadership of the Reich in accordance with Hitler's 1941 decree, naming him as his successor. Hitler's secretary Martin Bormann convinced Hitler that Göring was staging a coup, prompting Hitler to inform Göring that he would be executed immediately if he failed to surrender all of his posts. On April 28, Hitler received a BBC report originating from Reuters, stating that Reichsfuhrer Heinrich Himmler had offered Germany's surrender to the advancing Allied armies, which further threw Hitler into an inconsolable rage. He ordered Himmler's immediate arrest before executing Himmler's SS representative Hermann Fegelein. During Fegelein's execution by firing squad, the Red Army breached Berlin's defensives as far as the Potsdamer Platz, and all indications were that they were preparing to storm the Chancellery. This report and Himmler's treachery prompted Hitler to make the final decisions of his life. Shortly after midnight on April 29th, he married longtime girlfriend Eva Braun in a small civil ceremony in the map room of his bunker. Hitler then hosted a modest wedding breakfast with his wife, before taking Secretary Trottel Jung to another room to dictate his last will and testament. The following day, Hitler appeared in a bunker corridor to offer his final farewell to about 20 assembled people, shaking hands with each of them before retiring to his quarters for the final moments of his life. Hitler chose a pistol and poison method, which was suggested by his physician, while Eva Braun chose cyanide alone. Per Hitler's orders, both their bodies were dragged into a garden outside the bunker, doused in gasoline and set on fire. Records in the Soviet archives show that their burned remains were recovered and interred in successive locations until 1946, only to be exhumed yet again in 1970, so that their cremated remains could be scattered to an uncaring wind. VE Day. Following 6 years of bloody warfare, the Allies' punishing air and ground offensive at long last broke the back of the Nazi war machine. Heavy air attacks gained superiority over the German Luftwaffe, while repeated attacks on German oil refineries stopped the Nazis' mechanized ground advances in all fronts of the war in Europe. In March and April of 1945, Germany was in endgame as the Soviets closed in on the German capital of Berlin. On April 30th, Hitler and some of his top aides committed suicide, all but cementing the final collapse of the once dominant Nazi regime. On May the 8th, after the Allies accepted Germany's unconditional surrender of its armed forces, Allied nations erupted in mass celebration as the war in Europe came to a close. More than 1 million people celebrated on city streets throughout Great Britain, while crowds amassed in London's Trafalgar Square and up the Mall to Buckingham Palace, where King George VI and Queen Elizabeth joined Prime Minister Winston Churchill on a palace balcony, whipping the crowds into a triumphant high note. The future Queen Elizabeth II and her sister Princess Margaret were allowed to wander incognito among the amassing crowds, taking in the frenzy of celebration like average women on the street. Coinciding with Harry Truman's 61st birthday, the sitting American president dedicated the victory to the memory of his predecessor, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had died less than a month earlier from a catastrophic cerebral hemorrhage. As American cities erupted in celebration, by the end of the day, Truman confessed that the victory made it his most memorable birthday to date. In France, after years of Nazi occupation, the liberated French took to the streets in orderly jubilation, fully aware that better days were finally here to stay. While most celebrants felt the elation of victory in Europe, both Churchill and Truman tempered their citizens with the weighing truth that war against Japan had not yet been won. In his radio address on VE Day, Churchill told the British people that we may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing, but Japan remains unsubdued. In America, Truman's May 8th birthday broadcast said that the fall of the Nazis was a victory only halfway won. The Potsdam Declaration. While the objective of the Potsdam Conference of 1945 offered the chance for the Big Three Allied leaders to discuss the fate of post-war Europe, the Potsdam Declaration of July 26, 1945, was an intentionally ambiguous demand for Japan's immediate and unconditional surrender. Until newly minted U.S. President Harry S. Truman made his late appearance to the conference, at the insistence of the new British Prime Minister Clement Attlee and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, a ground invasion plan of Japan known as Operation Downfall had been widely discussed by Allied leaders, even though General Douglas MacArthur's own staff had resigned itself to an estimated 31,000 Allied casualties in the first month of combat alone. The Joint Chiefs were even more pessimistic, speculating that any successful invasion of Japan would come with an Allied death toll upwards of 500,000 lives. Ominously, the U.S. War Department had already ordered 500,000 Purple Heart medals in advance of the anticipated invasion. Instead, arriving to the meeting with news of a successful nuclear detonation at Alamogordo Bombing and Gunnery Range in New Mexico, Truman confided to the other leaders that the U.S. had 2 ready nuclear bombs for deployment. After absorbing the news, the leaders landed on a strategy which rested on 4 sequential elements: the issuance of an ultimatum of surrender to Japan, which, if unheeded, would prompt the Americans to drop one of their nuclear bombs on a major Japanese city. Next would come the public declaration of war upon Japan by the USSR, followed by more nuclear strikes on Japan until the empire finally capitulated. The strategy was a bold-faced bluff, since the US had only 2 working nuclear bombs at the time, with a substantial lag time before any additional bombs could be made ready. On August 6, 1945, a Boeing B-29 Superfortress named Enola Gay lifted off from Tinian Island with a bomb nicknamed Little Boy in its bomb bay hold. Hiroshima was the primary target, with Kokura and Nagasaki as backup alternatives. The nuclear weapon was armed shortly before arriving over the target, which was then dropped and detonated at an altitude of 1,750 feet, instantly destroying a 4.7 square mile area while killing an estimated 80,000 people. When Japan failed to capitulate, on August 9th, America's second nuclear bomb, nicknamed Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki, while a third bomb was expected by August 19th. 4 days before delivery, Japanese Emperor Hirohito formally announced the surrender of Japan. Today in the Daily Dose, the USS Indianapolis. Early in July 1945, the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis was ordered on a top-secret mission to deliver the uranium-235 core and other components for the atomic bomb intended for Hiroshima to the South Pacific island of Tinian. Following a successful delivery, the Indianapolis set sail for the island of Guam, where she would rejoin the rest of the American Pacific Fleet for their anticipated final push for Japan. Instead, shortly after midnight on July 29th, in low visibility conditions atop the Philippine Sea, the ship was struck by 2 torpedoes fired from a Japanese submarine, and while the ship's captain, Charles McVeigh, had requested an escort for protection, his request was denied due to the top-secret nature of her mission. Of the nearly 1,200 men aboard ship, when the Indianapolis rolled onto her side and sank in less than 12 minutes, 300 men went down with the ship, while 890 went into the water, in what would become a 4-day ordeal of hunger, dehydration, saltwater poisoning, exposure, and shark attacks.
From the net, and I also noticed that everybody tied to the net. Sharks didn't attack. So every time the sharks were coming in, we would kick and scream and do things that we thought would drive the sharks away, and they did drive them away. The sharks only picked off, as far as I could see, the sharks only picked off people who had by themselves. In other words, no protection around them. And whenever they saw a shark, they were to yell "shark" and start screaming. And I don't know whether that was effective or not. The sharks didn't like us, so they would leave us. But the sharks were and they attacked in groups. And when they died, I just cut them loose from the group and let them float out to sea. I didn't want the bodies around.
Of the 1,196 crewmen aboard the USS Indianapolis, only 317 survived their 4-day ordeal through grit, courage, and determination. And while Captain McVeigh was court-martialed in what many believed was a case of scapegoating for the 3 naval officers who had received and failed to act upon the Indianapolis's distress call during her final moments above water. McVeigh committed suicide in 1968, while he was posthumously cleared of any wrongdoing in 1996, thanks to the dogged efforts of survivors, legal professionals, and ex-military personnel, making the USS Indianapolis disaster a study in sacrifice, courage, and fortitude during the final days of World War II. And there you have it, the USS Indianapolis. Today on the Daily Dose. If you like learning something new every day, subscribe to the Daily Dose on YouTube or sign up for emails at dailydosenow.com.